On May 30, the 8 transports carrying the troops to invade Kiska and Attu left Ominato, the northernmost port of Honshu, accompanied by 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers, to rendezvous with another cruiser force hovering off the bleak Kuril Islands. On June 1, 1942, the entire strength of the Japanese combined fleet was at sea. Operation MI involved 145 ships whose boilers would burn more fuel than the Imperial Navy had used in the entire previous year, all directed to winning control of the tiny patch of Pacific coral sand whose 2,000 acres was less than their combined deck area. A weather front conveniently blanketed the eastward progress of those units that had sailed from Japan, adding to the general mood of anticipation aboard ship that their operation must succeed. So confident had the Japanese army unit been that it would be in control of Midway, the men had left instructions at Saipan for their mail to be sent on to the Island of the Rising Sun, the name chosen for the atoll. Yet even as it began, Yamamoto's over-elaborate choreography was starting to fall out of step. Operation K, for the planned seaplane reconnaissance flight, due to take place on May 30, had to be abandoned when the submarine detailed to carry out the refueling at the French frigate Shoals arrived to find an American mine layer at anchor. The 13 submarines that had set out to put an iron ring around Oahu arrived on their station a day late, failing to intercept the Pacific Fleet's 2 task forces, which were steaming toward Midway undetected. Yamamoto had written to Chiyoko Kawai, the former geisha plum dragon, who had been his intimate and mistress for 8 years. Now comes the crucial time. Of his long-anticipated decisive battle, he wrote enigmatically, "Not that I'm expecting very much of it," in marked contrast to his infectious show of confidence before his officers. So when he received the report from the Yamato's communications officer that they had picked up signals apparently indicating an American carrier in Hawaiian waters, he decided that it did not warrant prejudicing the whole operation by breaking radio silence, in spite of his staff's concern that the failure of their reconnaissance flight over Pearl Harbor might now prove more serious than at first thought. 300 miles deeper east into the Pacific, the Akagi's radio aerials were not high enough to intercept the weak signals from the Yorktown's air controller, so Admiral Nagumo had no grounds for the sort of suspicions troubling Yamamoto. He continued to rely on the intelligence reports radioed out from Naval Staff Headquarters in Tokyo. They had been completely convinced by the radio deceptions transmitted by the Tangier and the Salt Lake City into believing that the American carriers sighted 2 weeks before off the Solomons were still safely distant in the South Pacific. Since the Shoho required a 3-month refit, they also assumed that it was equally unlikely any American carrier damaged in the Coral Sea battle would be at sea before then. Good fortune and Japanese laxity gave the intelligence advantage to the Pacific Fleet until May 28, when the Japanese combined fleet finally switched over to their new codebooks. This effectively blocked the Hypo team from breaking the new fleet code for many weeks. Had the change been made only days earlier, it might have disrupted the whole of Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet's carefully laid ambush. The midget submarine attacks made on the Royal Navy battleship at Madagascar on May 31, and the sinking of a ferry in Sydney Harbour that evening, might have revived the fear that Japan was, after all, heading back toward Australia and the Indian Ocean. However, too much was now known about Admiral Yamamoto's Operation MI for Nimitz to fall for this feint or for the attack next day on the coast of Alaska. Fog and heavy cloud banks shrouding the barren Aleutian Islands had enabled Admiral Kurita's carriers to make a stealthy run eastward to within 200 miles of Unalaska Island by the morning of June 3, 1942. They had been undetected by the Navy PBY Catalinas that patrolled from the windswept base at Dutch Harbour. Admiral Theobald's task force of cruisers was over 400 miles away to the southeast, in pursuit of his own hunch that the Japanese would not invade Kiska and Attu but Kodiak, to menace the principal Alaskan mainland ports. Shortly after sunrise, Kurita had flown a strike off each of his carriers, headed in through soupy grey overcast toward Unalaska. Following maps that had been drawn up from charts 30 years out of date, the Junyo's planes lost their way and were forced to return to refuel. The Ryujo's strike had better luck, breaking through the clouds into bright sunshine almost within sight of Dutch Harbour. Not until 8 a.m. did the American radar pick up the incoming attack. This gave only a few minutes' warning before a dozen Japanese planes spitting fire came roaring in. There was no time to clear shipping or to get the PBY flying boats and a few of the Army's P-40 fighters into the air. The raid set fuel storage tanks ablaze, demolished part of the barracks and the wooden huts housing the hospital. Several PBYs were wrecked in addition to the radio station, at the cost of a single enemy plane that plunged into the icy waters of the harbour after being hit by anti-aircraft gunfire. The 9 Japanese dive bombers and 2 surviving fighters managed to get back to the Ryujo, where they were refueled to fly off on a second strike. However, in thick cloud, they lost the destroyers and submarines they had earlier sighted in Makushin Bay. When the signals reporting the success of the Dutch harbour raid were brought to Admiral Yamamoto's cabin aboard the Yamato that morning, his appetite revived for breakfast after 2 days of nervous stomach cramps. Far out to the east ahead of his flagship, the strike force was struggling through a fog bank so thick that Nagumo's carriers turned on their searchlights to avoid collisions. The weather front prevented any aerial reconnaissance as they approached the point where he was scheduled to swing around from a northeasterly course to the southeast for the final run-in toward Midway. Lack of up-to-date intelligence on enemy movements aroused his caution. "But where is the enemy fleet?" he asked his staff repeatedly, before accepting that there was no choice in the dense fog but to permit the flagship's lowest-powered radio to transmit the change of course order. Nagumo's brief mid-morning signal caused a minor alarm when it was picked up by the Yamato, following some 600 miles astern. Despite Yamamoto's fears, however, it was not heard by any of the American task forces some 700 miles to the east as they steamed about Point Luck 200 miles northwest of Midway. But only minutes earlier, a PBY Catalina patrolling down the extreme arc of its search pattern some 700 miles west of Midway had torn aside the curtain of secrecy the Japanese believed still concealed their moves. "Do you see what I see?" Ensign Jack Reed, the flying boat's skipper, asked his co-pilot as he grabbed his binoculars. 30 miles ahead, he had sighted the transports carrying the approaching Midway occupation force. For 2 hours, the Catalina tracked the convoy to confirm its course and speed before radioing. "Main body, bearing 262, distance 700 miles. 11 ships, course 090, speed 19 knots. The alarm sent the Army's B-17s roaring off the atoll's runways. "This will clear up all the doubters now. They had just to see this to know what I told them is correct," Nimitz told Commander Layton, passing him the sighting report picked up immediately after the news of the raid on Dutch harbour. To avoid any possible risk that it might send Fletcher's task forces chasing south to hit the transport fleet, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet radioed an urgent signal. "Main body. That is not, repeat not, the enemy striking force." It was to be well into the afternoon of June 3 before the 19 flying fortresses had rumbled west across the international dateline into the next calendar day to reach the Japanese convoy. Hitting a slow-moving target from over 10,000 feet up was a difficult assignment for the most practiced bomb aimers in the Army Air Force, and impossible for bombardiers as unpracticed as these ex-civilians, who only months before had been taxi drivers, salesmen and farmhands. But they were sufficiently impressed by the spectacular waterspouts thrown up by their explosives to radio back enthusiastically the sinking of several Normandy-type vessels. Landing at Midway that afternoon, 4 new Navy PBY Catalina reinforcements were surprised to be ordered to load up with torpedoes and take off immediately for a second attack. It was late into the evening when the flying boats, with engines throttled right back, came swooping out of a velvet-black moonlit sky. Making a low pass over the transports, they dropped torpedoes that damaged a tanker but failed to halt the Japanese convoy's eastward march toward Midway. The reports of these 2 attacks left Admiral Yamamoto in no doubt that his Midway invasion plan had been unmasked, but it did not unduly concern him or his staff. They decided it would only serve to bring the main body of the Pacific Fleet sortying out of Pearl Harbor a few hours earlier than they had originally intended. Midway was the bait in his carefully sprung trap. The advance jaw of the carrier strike force was heading for the dawn airstrike on the atoll across a starlit ocean whose tranquil beauty erupted as a jittery gunner on an escorting heavy cruiser fired off at an imaginary aircraft. On Midway itself, the tense night of June 3 passed in agonizing slowness. Marine gunners hoped they would not meet the same fate that had overtaken Wake as they tried to catch what sleep they could beside their batteries. The air crews of the 110 planes defending the atoll dozed beside their radios, ready to scramble as the headquarters watch, fixed on the glowing radar screen, sent invisible electromagnetic fingers into the Pacific night. Aboard the 3 American carriers 300 miles to the northeast, it was also a long night. Many men wrote eve-of-battle letters to loved ones. The Yorktown Flyers broke their craps marathon at 9 p.m., just long enough to hear Lieutenant Dick Crowell tell them, "The fate of the United States now rests in the hands of 240 pilots." In the hangar decks of all 3 carriers, the mechanics slaved through the night preparing their planes, while the galley hands turned out thousands of sandwiches for sustenance during the next day's action. The situation is developing as expected. Carriers' most important objective should be located, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet flashed in a reassuring signal to his task force commanders, reminding them, tomorrow may be the day you can give them the works. Pearl Harbor was on red alert against enemy seaplanes, and as far away as the West Coast radio stations had been silenced to prevent enemy bombers homing in on San Francisco. Standing 400 miles out to sea, a bobbing line of assorted yachts and requisitioned civilian patrol craft waited for enemy battleships to loom over the dark horizon. Sunrise had already ended the lonely night's vigil for the volunteer Coast Guards off California when dawn broke over the Japanese and American carrier forces. Far across the Pacific, the United States Navy air crews were piped out of their bunks at 1:30 a.m. for a hearty steak-and-egg breakfast. Less than 300 miles away to the west, Imperial Navy pilots in their flying gear were breakfasting off trays loaded with ample dishes of rice, soybean soup, pickles, dried chestnuts, followed by a battle toast in warm sake. The 2 opposing forces were at the end of a giant V, 200 miles long, with its point hinged on Midway. While the American commanders had a good idea of the position of the Japanese, Admiral Nagumo, after reviewing the latest intelligence reports from Tokyo, had concluded at the final pre-dawn briefing. There is no evidence of an enemy task force in our vicinity. With the concurrence of Commander Genda, who was roused from the sick bay where he was recovering from pneumonia, the first strike wave was to be armed with high-explosive bombs to attack Midway, destroy the land-based planes there, and support the landing operation. This wave comprised 72 bombers and 36 fighters, leaving 126 planes in reserve, loaded with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes. We can then turn around, meet an enemy task force and destroy it, Nagumo assured his staff, confident they would still be left with a force of 36 Zero fighters to fly combat patrol over the carriers, which would steam in a tight box formation to ensure the maximum protection from the guns of his battleships and cruisers. Believing that he had more than adequately ensured his striking force's defense against being jumped, Nagumo now made a fatal mistake by not ordering out all 10 float planes carried by his battleships and cruisers to make a thorough dawn reconnaissance of the ocean around Midway. He might well have dispatched more than 4 float planes if his suspicions had been aroused, as Yamamoto's had, that an American carrier was as close as Hawaii 3 days earlier. Fate again intervened to reduce the effectiveness of the mission when the heavy cruiser Tone's jammed catapult delayed the launching of the plane assigned the most easterly leg of the search pattern, one that in just over an hour would have taken him over the American carriers. The grey skies over the Japanese strike force were suffused with saffron at 4:30, when the first of the 128 planes heading for Midway raced down the Akagi to lift off. It passed over the blood-red identification disc that had been painted at the bow end of the wooden flight deck. Watching in deep regret that an operation for appendicitis the day after the flagship sailed from Hiroshima had kept him from leading the attack was Commander Fuchida. This time the honour of leading the double Vs of the attack forming up in the brightening sky was given to Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who was making his first seaborne operation at the head of Hiryu's squadron of Val bombers. June 4, 1942, dawned auspiciously bright and clear over the American task forces, with only a few puffy clouds floating in the sky and a gentle southeasterly trade wind. The Midway PBY Catalina patrols had taken off from the island's lagoon well before sunrise and were now fanning out across the blue expanse of ocean like the spokes of a great wheel over 1,000 miles in diameter. Admiral Fletcher was relying on their reconnaissance to pick up the disposition of the approaching enemy forces. To make doubly certain that he found the Japanese carriers before they found him, he dispatched a reconnaissance patrol to search the ocean northwest of where Layton's latest bulletin had predicted the enemy were moving in on Midway. With his strike planes bombed and fueled, the pilots donned flying gear to wait in the briefing rooms for news of the enemy's position before taking off to attack. As the minutes turned into hours, they envied the Wildcat fighter pilots who were flying the cover duties over their carriers, and the Yorktown's 10 Dauntless dive bomber crews, who had been out scouring the ocean since sunrise. Flying up the leg of the same giant V from Midway, as the Japanese strike was heading down, was Lieutenant Howard Addy's PBY. An hour into his mission, he sighted a seaplane closing in on him below on the opposite course, prompting his radioed aircraft alert. 15 minutes behind his plane, another Catalina, flown by Lieutenant William Chase, was also heading northwest up the search sector. At 5:45 a.m. he signalled, "Many enemy planes heading Midway bearing 320 degrees distant, 150 miles." Only minutes followed before Addy pushed through a cloud bank to see, just 20 miles ahead and below, the curtain rise on the biggest show on Earth. It was Nagumo's striking force. Radioing enemy carriers, he ducked into the clouds again to dodge the fighters, later finishing the message awaited by Midway Command. 2 carriers, 2 battleships bearing 320 degrees distant, 180 miles course, 135 degrees speed, 25 knots. Picked up and relayed from Midway to Pearl Harbor by cable, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Staff now could give a positive position to their main target on the operational plot. A beaming Nimitz congratulated Commander Layton. "Well, you were only 5 miles off." Aboard the Yorktown and Enterprise, the air staff of the 2 task forces were laying off courses that would bring their carriers' aircraft within striking distance of the enemy force. Unwilling to betray his presence by radioing a recall to the reconnaissance flight of Dauntless, Admiral Fletcher flashed by signal lamp to Spruance 8 miles astern. "Proceed southwesterly and attack enemy carriers when definitely located will follow as soon as planes recovered." Aboard the Enterprise, the Admiral and his Chief of Staff, Browning, had been busy with chart and dividers, computing that it would take 3 hours more steaming at full speed in the direction of Midway to bring the enemy carriers within range of an airstrike. On the airstrip on the atoll's eastern island, the runways had been humming with taxiing aircraft as everything that could fly was being put into the air before the Japanese attack arrived. The PBYs lumbered off the lagoon to cruise around a safe distance to the east, while the Navy's 6 Avenger torpedo strike planes, followed by the 4 Army B-26 Marauder twin-engine bombers, led off the waves heading out to the northwest. The second wave was made up of the 16 Marine Dauntless dive bombers, trailed by the Army's B-17 Fortresses. Last came the slow 11 Marine Vindicator torpedo bombers. The island's 27 Wildcat fighters and Marine Buffaloes then took off to climb to 12,000 feet, ready to swoop down on the enemy. When the din of hundreds of aero engines died, a silence descended over the atoll, except for the relentless booming of the surf and the squawks of goonie birds. It was broken only by the commands relayed over loudspeakers as the Marines took cover beneath their sandbagged emplacements, and steel-helmeted gun crews on the 2 Sandy Spits swung their anti-aircraft batteries toward the northwest. At 6:16 a.m., the probing radar beams at last picked up the incoming planes, still invisible 74 miles out over the horizon, as a countdown began over the loudspeaker to the opening of the anti-aircraft barrage. The Japanese attack had barely time to close half that distance before Major Floyd B. Parks's Marine Fighter Squadron had dived into the midst of the formation of Japanese VALs, and Kates escorted by protective Zeros. Watching the swirling dogfights through field glasses, Lieutenant Colonel Ira E. Kimes, the 2nd Marine Air Wing commander, could see with dismay that the 36 Zero's spectacular maneuverability once again triumphed over the obsolescent Buffaloes and Wildcats. His pilots battled valiantly, as 17 were shot down, and 7 planes so badly hit they would never take to the air again. While Midway's fighter defense was tied up, Lieutenant Tomonaga led his Kates in to make their bombing runs completely unopposed from 14,000 feet, scarcely troubled by the mushrooming burst of anti-aircraft shells. The attack destroyed the seaplane hangar and set the oil tanks and hospital ablaze on Sand Island. On Eastern Island, they failed to carry out their objective of putting the atoll's airstrips out of operation, succeeding only in wrecking the powerhouse and the Marine command post. After 20 minutes, when the Japanese planes had exhausted their bombs, the raid ended. All but 4 bombers and 2 fighters headed back toward the carriers, as Tomonaga tersely radioed Akagi at 6:50 a.m., second attack necessary. Just 10 minutes later, the need for a second strike was forcefully made when the buglers aboard the Japanese warships trumpeted out the air raid alarm. For nearly an hour, the Akagi's fighter controller had been vainly trying to vector his Zeros in to shoot down the American PBYs, who adopted the very cunning maneuver of dodging in and out of the clouds as they radioed in the attacking flights from Midway. Without radar, Admiral Nagumo only received a late warning of the approaching enemy bombers from the Tone's float plane. Additional Zero fighters raced off from the Akagi, and at this moment, Fuchida, still weak from his operation, collapsed. Refusing to be taken to the sickbay, he was propped up on deck with a parachute to watch with astonishment as the American torpedo planes flew in low with no fighter protection. Lieutenant L.K. Fieberling led his 6 Avenger torpedo bombers in on a high-risk mission. Still, they kept coming in, flying low over the water. Black bursts of anti-aircraft fire blossomed all around them, but none of the raiders went down. As Akagi's guns commenced firing, 3 Zeros braved our own fire and dove on the Americans. In a moment's time, 3 of the enemy were aflame and splashed into the water, raising tall columns of smoke. The 3 remaining planes kept bravely on and finally released their torpedoes. One was hit and crashed off the carrier's deck in a blazing fireball. The Akagi easily swung around to dodge the slow-running American torpedoes. Only a single Avenger survived the attack to return and report its tragic failure. They were followed by the 4 B-26 bombers. It was the first torpedo attack the Army pilots had ever made, and their courage in flying so low into so much fire greatly surpassed their skill. As the Japanese gunners blazed away, it was an unfamiliar experience for them to see large twin-engine planes so close they could estimate the size of the White Star insignia on the wings. One bored straight into the ocean, another dropped its torpedo before passing so low over the Akagi that it swept away the flagship's radio aerials. A third crashed in flames before reaching the carrier. The attack petered out at 7:15 a.m. with the Japanese gun crews congratulating themselves on their easy victory and Fuchida pondering on the courage of the American pilots. Up on the Akagi's flag bridge, Admiral Nagumo was in agitated discussion with his staff, making the most critical tactical decision of the battle. The air raid on the strike force left no doubts about the need for another strike against Midway, but the 93 aircraft that were ready for takeoff were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs to attack warships, not runways. Taking the advice of his air operations officer, Genda, Admiral Nagumo gave orders that the aircraft should be taken below to the hangars to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs. Less than 200 miles away, their opponents were steaming down the westerly leg of the V from the Japanese carriers, when news that Midway had been raided caused Spruance and Browning's air staff to reconsider their earlier decision not to launch aircraft until 9 o'clock. Quick calculation revealed that the enemy carriers could be attacked while they were recovering their Midway strike, presenting a golden chance to hit them at the most vulnerable moment. Accepting the risk that the range might be just too great for his torpedo bombers to make the return flight without running out of fuel, Spruance nevertheless decided to seize this tactical advantage to launch a powerful strike first. The chances that the American task forces would be discovered were increasing by the minute as the distance between them and the Japanese narrowed. Spruance boldly ordered a strike by every bomber the Enterprise and the Hornet carried, holding back only 36 fighters to fly a combat patrol. Launching operations began just before 7 a.m. with Task Force 16 turning into the southeasterly breeze. Flying off operations were therefore to take the American carriers away from the enemy force, a problem that plagued Spruance and Fletcher throughout that day's battle. It took more than an hour to get the 20 Wildcat fighters, 67 Dauntless dive bombers, and 29 Devastator torpedo bombers into the air. The slow takeoffs became even more painful for Spruance after the sighting of a Japanese scout plane on the horizon, when less than half his strike were airborne and burning up precious fuel circling. The enemy pilot's agitated radio transmissions, picked up by the Enterprise, indicated he was relaying position reports to the Japanese carriers. At 7:45, Spruance gave orders for Lieutenant C.W. McCluskey, leader of the dive bombers, to head off without waiting for the rest of the Hornet's strike. Following some 25 miles astern of Task Force 16's wake, Admiral Fletcher had by now decided that the Yorktown must launch her attack. The Midway PBY patrols had not reported sighting any other enemy carriers, but even so, he decided not to risk repeating his mistake at the Coral Sea by sending off all his planes. Half were kept in reserve as a wave of 17 Dauntlesses, 16 Devastators, and 6 Wildcats zoomed off to the west. The American commanders by 8:30 had sent 155 aircraft out in 3 waves to attack the Japanese carriers. Not a single Japanese plane was yet heading to attack them. Nearly an hour had passed since Spruance's force had been spotted by the float plane from the cruiser Tone, which had started its reconnaissance half an hour late because of the jammed catapult. Its pilot had only then spotted Task Force 16 by chance, as he was making the final dogleg of his search pattern before heading back to the cruiser to refuel. Ships apparently enemy-sighted bearing 10 degrees distant, 240 miles midway. Course 150 degrees, speed more than 30 knots. The Tone's plane flashed out. The alarm was rushed up to the Akagi's bridge only 20 minutes after Nagumo had decided to launch a second strike on Midway. The totally unexpected news that there were United States Navy units less than 200 miles away hit the Admiral and his staff like a bolt out of the blue. The signal did not make it plain whether the ships included a carrier. Nagumo concluded he could not risk assuming that there was no carrier. Below decks, the flagship's hangar crews were halfway through the time-consuming task of rearming the second strike with high explosives, so orders were made to the 3 other carriers. Prepare to carry out attack on enemy fleet units. Leave torpedoes on those attack planes which have not yet changed to bombs. Nagumo now desperately needed to know whether the enemy units included a carrier before making a final decision to call off the second Midway raid. Ascertain ship types and maintain contact was radioed to the Tone's scout. 10 minutes passed without any response. Then, infuriatingly, the pilot signalled only a change in course report. Tempers rose on Akagi's flag bridge. At 8:09, the message, "Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers," brought Nagumo only brief relief. 11 minutes later, he received the electrifying report brought up from the radio room. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be an aircraft carrier bringing up the rear. The Tone's pilot was cursed for his vagueness. A fierce debate broke out between Nagumo and his staff about what to do next. In 10 minutes, the first of the Midway strike planes would be returning with fuel tanks low as the rearming of the second strike was nearing completion. If it was to be launched before landing on operations, Nagumo would have to watch his first wave planes pancaking into the sea as they ran out of fuel. But if he did not launch a strike immediately against the enemy carrier, he risked being caught by American bombs with his flight decks jammed with parked aircraft. It was the worst possible predicament for a carrier commander. As he argued with his staff, trying to find a way out of the tactical dilemma, Nagumo's discomfort was heightened by the arrival of a new strike from Midway. Dive bombers led by Major Lofton P. Henderson came in without fighter escort on low-gliding runs that made them easy targets for the Zeros. Half the 16 Marine Dauntlesses were shot down, and 6 of the 8 that managed to get back to the airstrip on Midway were so badly damaged that they never took off again. Hard on their heels, at 8:10, arrived the 15 Flying Fortresses, which dropped their bombs from 20,000 feet through wispy clouds. A great deal of water was churned up, doing no damage, although the Army pilots would claim to have sunk 2 carriers. 10 minutes later, the 11 Vindicators, led by Major Benjamin Norris, lumbered in to deliver their torpedoes. The Zeros were so fast, and the wind indicators, as the Marine pilots sarcastically called their ancient planes, so tardy that the carriers easily outmaneuvered them. Instead, they concentrated their run on the battleship Hiruna, but none of their torpedoes connected with a Japanese warship. It was nothing short of a miracle that Norris managed to get 9 of his planes back safely, with their wings peppered full of bullet holes. The tail end of the Midway airstrikes might not have scored a single hit, but they had thrown Nagumo's force into the confusion of having to maneuver sharply to avoid torpedoes, while the Admiral and his staff tried to wrestle with their critical decision. Watching through the periscope of the submarine Nautilus was Lieutenant Commander Brockman, who had been on surface patrol when his radio operator picked up the first PBY Catalina report, and he successfully managed to intercept the Japanese. Taking advantage of the renewed air attack to select a target, his periscope was spotted. Ships were on all sides moving across the field at high speed and circling away to avoid the submarine's position. Nonetheless, he successfully fired one torpedo, which failed to find its battleship target, before diving at 825 to 125 feet to ride out a depth charge attack from the escorting destroyers. At 8:30, with the Midway strike wave due to return, Admiral Taman Yamaguchi of the 2nd Carrier Division was growing impatient with the hesitation aboard the flagship. The Kaga and Akagi were still loading their second strike planes with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, but the Hiryu and the Soryu already had 36 armed dive bombers ready to take off. Their covering fighter escort had been sent aloft to meet the series of American attacks, but Yamaguchi, an aggressively brilliant tactician who was considered a future commander-in-chief, believed that any delay in making a strike against the enemy was madness. "Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately," he flashed from the Hiryu. The strike force's original box formation had now been pushed out by the air assault into a diamond shape, with Yamaguchi's carrier so far away that his signal had to be relayed to the Akagi by destroyer. On the assurance of his staff that recovery operations could be completed in half an hour, Admiral Nagumo, again with Commander Genda's acquiescence, finally decided that the first strike must be landed, refueled and rearmed before flying off on a mission to hit the enemy force. This meant getting the second strike planes already coming up on deck down below once more. "Here we go again," Akagi's flight officer Masuda called. "This is getting to be like a quick change contest." Elevator warning bells began clanging as the parked aircraft were struck down to the hangars to clear the flight decks for recovery. Weary crews began hauling up more trucks of bombs and torpedoes. Because the turnaround was being rushed, there were no hands or time to begin stowing the high-explosive bombs offloaded from the second strike safely into the magazines. They were simply stacked, many still fused, in the hangars, while on deck the landings began. After completing recovery operations, we planned to contact and destroy enemy force. Nagumo signalled to his carrier captains, at the same time radioing Yamamoto the dramatic news that a carrier force had been found, informing him, "We will head for it." Landing-on operations were completed on schedule just after 9. The decks of the Japanese carriers were a scene of feverish activity as refuelling began. Hoses snaked across the decks and trolleys of bombs and ammunition wheeled out to rearm the planes. Nagumo had set a 10:30 deadline for launching a 102-plane strike, less than his full strength, because he had still received no reports of there being more than a single American carrier. At the same time, a fast float plane had been dispatched to confirm the reconnaissance of the Tone's scout, but it had yet to reach the reported enemy force. When it did so a few minutes later, the pilot found to his dismay that his radio had packed up. In that frantic half-hour of activity following the American air and submarine attacks, Nagumo had overlooked the warning flashed 20 minutes before by one of the scouting float planes. 10 enemy torpedo planes heading towards you. At 9:18, the striking force was steaming north in its diamond formation, with Hiryu some 8 miles ahead of the Akagi, flanked by the Kaga and Soryu, when the outlying destroyers on the starboard screen began frantically signalling an aircraft warning and throwing up a smoke screen. Bugles blared out aboard the flagship, signal lamps flashed, speed preparations for immediate takeoff, sending aircrews running across the tangle of fuel lines for their planes. Zeros began roaring off into the sky to join the air patrol already racing down on the enemy torpedo planes. Was there any escape? Fuchida wondered, as he lay propped up on the Akagi's flight command post. An electric thrill ran throughout the fleet as our interceptors took off amid the cheers of all who had time and opportunity to see them. The Hornet's squadron of 15 torpedo planes took off with their leader, Lieutenant John C. Waldron, knowing that the chances of his men getting back were slim. Their devastators were obsolete and slow, with tanks holding only enough fuel for a round trip of 300 miles. When they took off, the Japanese carriers were 175 miles away. If there is only one plane left to make a final run-in, Waldron, part Sioux Indian, had told his pilots, I want that man to go in and get a hit. After losing touch with his fighter escort, he was headed out on a northerly course, following his Indian instinct rather than the flight briefing. It paid off at 9:20 when he spotted the enemy carrier force. Now some of his pilots were worrying that they were uncomfortably vulnerable without their escorts. Waldron, however, showed no hesitation in waggling his wings as the signal for his men to follow him down. He went straight for the Japanese fleet as if he had a string tied to them, reported Ensign George Gay, who was the sole survivor after the torpedo planes fell victim to 40 Zeros before they had ever reached torpedo dropping range. Waldron was an early casualty. Gay's last sight was of his leader trying to bail out of a flaming plane. Their distant wings flashed in the sun, Fuchida would recall, as he watched the massacre of the torpedo planes off the Akagi's starboard quarter. Occasionally, one of the specks burst into a spark of flame and trailed black smoke as it fell into the water. Our fighters were on the job, and the enemy seemed again to be without fighter protection. Chunks were being torn out of Ensign Gay's plane by heavy anti-aircraft fire as he dropped his torpedo before zooming over the carrier. I could see the Japanese captain jumping up and down and raising hell. I could see the deck full of gas hoses and planes. With rudder controls shot away, Gay managed to pancake into the sea. Bleeding from bullet wounds, he crawled out of the waterlogged cockpit to take shelter under a seat cushion for a grandstand view of the opening round of the battle. After the Japanese had steamed off north, he inflated his yellow life raft, which kept him afloat until he was picked up the next day by a PBY. Hard on the heels of Waldron's gallant band came the 14 torpedo planes from the Enterprise, led by Commander Eugene E. Lindsay. Among the first planes to take off, almost 3 hours of flying had left his devastators low on fuel and unable to wait around for the fighters to find them. The missing Wildcats were, in fact, circling 20,000 feet above, awaiting Lindsay's radio call to bring them down. They never responded as Lindsay split his squadron into 2s and 3s to attack the Kaga and Akagi. As his plane slid down into a shallow dive, the enemy carriers were making 30 knots, showing their sterns to give their gunners and fighters more time to break up the slow-moving torpedo bombers. Lindsay and 9 of his slow devastators were shot down with no bomb hits. The same sad fate befell Commander Lance E. Massey, who arrived about 10 a.m. with the Yorktown's 12 torpedo planes. His escort of 6 Wildcats was overpowered by a swarm of Zeros, which shot down 7 of his planes. 5 closed to attack the Soryu, whose helmsman dodged the slow-running American torpedoes. Only 2 devastators were to get back to the Enterprise. Aboard the Akagi, Nagumo and his staff watched with relief the slaughter of the first wave of attackers. His force had won a breathing space without damage as orders went out, urging the carrier deck crews to speed up completion of refueling operations. At any moment, the American dive bombers might appear. The Japanese carrier's fate was now in the sweating hands of the men frantically trying to get the planes into the air and hose lines stowed before the bombs started falling. Every second was vital. Tension was also fraying the nerves of Fletcher and Spruance, who were listening into the radio relays on the bridges of the Yorktown and the Enterprise, respectively. In the operations room at Pearl Harbor, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet staff were also eavesdropping on the static-filled aircraft control channels of their carriers. Anxiety was mounting because no positive news had come in for nearly 2 hours. A PBY report, relayed from Midway at 9:26, signaling the enemy invasion force 320 miles to the southwest, did not tell when the task force's airstrikes would reach the Japanese carriers. The normally imperturbable Nimitz was as frantic as I have ever seen him, before the radio crackled just before 10 with the Enterprise air officer yelling, "Attack! Attack!" "Wilco, as soon as I can find them," came the crisp reply. Commander Browning's angry order had been directed not from the fighter escort for his carrier's torpedo planes, but from his flight of dive bombers. For nearly 2 hours, Lieutenant Clarence W. McCluskey had been leading 37 Dauntlesses in search of a contact, unaware that the Japanese had swung around onto a more northerly course. This had inadvertently saved Nagumo from the 35 dive bombers sent out from the Hornet, which had hunted their target for over an hour before abandoning the mission to refuel at Midway. Fortunately for his country, McCluskey had led his hunt north, finding the destroyer that had been left to depth charge the Nautilus hightailing northwest in what he guessed was the direction of the Japanese force. The Enterprise dive bombers roared down on the Japanese carriers as the 2 surviving Yorktown devastators were being chased away from their abortive attack by Zeros. Fortune, which had previously deserted the American torpedo bombers, now ensured that their sacrifice had not been made in vain. The 3 successive attacks, which had cost 41 planes and the lives of 80 airmen, had also pulled down the Japanese fighter cover to deck level. Not even a Zero was fast enough to climb up to disrupt the tight formations of dive bombers hurtling down from 10,000 feet. Picking the 2 largest carriers, McCluskey's Dauntlesses went into a 70-degree dive, their juddering bomb sights locked on the red deck roundels of the Akagi and the Kaga, whose decks were being cleared from refueling lines and pilots scrambling for their planes. "Hell divers," Fuchida recalled, as the alarm sounded at 10:24, and he looked up with horror at the American bombers looming larger by the second as he crawled for cover. The terrifying scream of the dive bombers reached me first, followed by the crashing of a direct hit. There was a blinding flash, and then a second explosion much louder than the first. I was shaken by a weird blast of warm air. There was still another shock, but less severe, apparently a near miss, then followed by a startling quiet as the barking guns suddenly ceased. I got up and looked at the sky. The enemy planes were already gone from sight. I was horrified at the destruction that had been wrought in a matter of seconds. There was a huge hole in the flight deck just behind the midship elevator. The elevator itself, twisted like molten glass, was drooping into the hangar. Deck plates reeled in grotesque configurations. Planes stood tail up, belching livid flames and jet-black smoke. Reluctant tears streamed down my cheeks as I watched the fires spread, and I was terrified at the prospect of induced explosions, which would surely doom the ship. Bombs began detonating in the fierce heat of the pools of burning fuel, turning the Akagi's flight deck into a scene terrible to behold. Fire parties were driven back by the searing heat. The bomb which was to doom the flagship had ripped through the elevator, detonating in the hangar among the unstowed torpedoes. Bursting fireballs turned the great hangar into a roaring furnace that the extinguishing system was powerless to control. As a precaution, Captain Aoki ordered the magazines flooded. Out on the burning flagship's starboard wing, 4 bombs were dealing a similar fate to the Kaga. The first burst on her starboard quarter. The second and third wrecked the forward elevator and exploded below the island bridge, setting parked aircraft ablaze and killing the captain along with many of his senior officers. The fourth penetrated the hangar space, setting off a chain of detonations among bombs and torpedoes. Firefighters battled the engulfing tide of flame, and the carrier's speed began dropping as the flight officer assumed command. Still recovering from the attack on his flagship, Admiral Nagumo now looked out appalled to see 2 carriers also ablaze. The Yorktown's dive bombers had made short work of the Soryu. Thanks to the skillful navigation of Lieutenant Commander Maxwell E. Leslie, his 18 Dauntlesses, which had taken off over an hour after the Enterprise's strike, had cut corners in their flight to arrive within minutes of McCluskey's planes. Although a faulty switch had prematurely released his bomb, Leslie led his attack in notwithstanding. Guns flashed as 2 bombs hurled the carrier's elevator onto the bridge and set the parked planes ablaze, while a third detonated in the hangar. The rapidity of the 6-minute attack paralyzed the Japanese defenses. None of the Yorktown's Dauntlesses were hit, although 16 of McCluskey's pilots were shot down by pursuing Zeros. They had, however, achieved a decisive victory. At the cost of 47 planes, the United States Navy had eliminated 3/4 of the Imperial Navy's crack carrier strike force. The Soryu, whose fires had by now taken uncontrollable hold, was the first to order abandon ship less than 20 minutes after the attack ended. Captain Yamamoto supervised the ceremonial transfer of the Emperor's picture to a destroyer before seeking a warrior's death in the flames. An hour later, a volunteer party of firefighters reboarded the crippled carrier, and were having some success in their efforts to bring her under control, when at 2 p.m. Lieutenant Commander Brockman of the Nautilus caught up to slam 2 torpedoes home. 2 hours after that, the American submarine surfaced to investigate the blazing hulk, which sank shortly after 7 p.m., taking down the bodies of 700 crew. The cargo's acting captain was to order the ritual transfer of the Imperial portrait at 1:30 p.m., when the inferno below decks cut off the engine room. Abandoned ship came at 5 p.m., and 2 hours later exploding fuel storage tanks in the overheated hull sent the carrier to the bottom with 800 men, many trapped alive in the machinery spaces. Nagumo's flagship managed to keep under way for 20 minutes, until violent maneuvers to dodge an attack by 4 torpedo planes jammed the Akagi's rudders. The starboard turbines went dead as she swung away from another reported attack at 10:40 a.m. Power was failing, and flames were leaping up to the bridge from the blazing wreckage of aircraft, as Nagumo, still in a daze, resisted the entreaties of his staff to evacuate his command to a waiting destroyer. By 10:47 a.m., the reluctant admiral was persuaded to make an undignified escape from a bridge window down a rope. Last down was Fuchida, who found the rope smouldering and the iron ladder too hot to hold, forcing him to jump and fracture both his ankles. Strapped to a bamboo stretcher, he joined the hundreds of burned and wounded who were taken across to the destroyer from the anchor deck. Evacuation was ordered at 11:30 a.m. by Captain Aoki, who remained on board to direct the desperate attempt to control the spreading conflagration. At 1 p.m., the Emperor's picture was taken off, but not until 7:30 p.m. did the captain give the final call to abandon ship, after insisting on lashing himself to a bulkhead to go down with his command. The blazing Akagi was still afloat at midnight when his officers reboarded to rescue their captain over his vehement protests. 4 hours later, on orders from Yamamoto, the carrier was dispatched by a destroyer's torpedoes. When Nagumo transferred his flag to the destroyer Nagara shortly before 11 a.m., he still had the undamaged Hiryu, as well as 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and a dozen destroyers under his command. This gave him a fighting chance to strike back at the American task forces, though it meant that the planes still aloft from the 3 blazing carriers would have to be ditched. "Attack enemy carriers," the Hiryu was signalled. Nagumo's staff knew that so many aircraft could not have come from one carrier, but Captain Yamaguchi's confirmation, "All our planes are taking off now for the purpose of destroying the enemy carrier," suggested that from his position nearly 10 miles ahead, he had failed to realize this. Acting on reports from the cruiser's scouting planes, which had so far only spotted the Yorktown's task force, he sent out only 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters. Conflicting and often indecipherable exchanges on the pilot's radio network had also presented a confused picture of the battle to Fletcher and Spruance. Not until the first aircraft had returned 90 minutes into the action did they finally learn of the American victory in the first round of the battle. Merely getting back to the Enterprise proved to be another ordeal for that carrier's pilots, when they found that their floating landing strip was not at the point option. Task Force 16's air controllers had neglected to radio out an updated position, which had brought the force 60 miles to the east because of turning into the wind to launch and recover their fighters, while the Dauntlesses were airborne. McCluskey landed his plane with just 2 gallons of fuel left. Others were not so lucky, ditching when their engines cut. Task Force 17's air control had been more diligent, and Commander Leslie got all his victorious dive bombers back safely. Mid-morning on June 4 was a time for cautious celebration for the American task forces and in the operations room at Pearl Harbor. A very different mood set in over the combined fleet's flagship, when Nagumo's signal was received just before 11 a.m., fires raging aboard Kaga, Soryu, Akagi, resulting from attacks carried out by enemy land-based and carrier-based planes. We plan to have Hiryu engage the enemy carriers. In the meantime, we are retiring to the north. The devastating news filled Yamamoto's staff with horror, yet their admiral showed no immediate reaction. His features, already unhealthily pallid from his stomach complaint, just seemed to tighten minutely. Faced with the prospect that his whole operation, as well as the decisive naval engagement, would slip from his grasp unless he could concentrate his scattered forces, he radioed urgent orders to the two carriers south of the Aleutians to join up with Admiral Kondo's force, now heading at utmost speed for Midway. In spite of Nagumo's message, it was possible that only one American carrier was at sea. If the Hiryu's aircraft could knock it out, his remaining 5 carriers and 7 battleships might yet win a decisive victory. Just before noon, the Yorktown's radar picked up the Hiryu's dive bombers heading in from the west when they were still nearly 50 miles away. Fletcher had guessed that one of the Japanese carriers might still be unaccounted for and had already sent out 10 Dauntlesses to scout for her. This delayed the landing of the remainder of Commander Leslie's dive bombers circling overhead. Now they were ordered away to a safe distance, as 12 Wildcats were sent up to meet the incoming attack. Down below, the carrier's fuel lines were flooded with carbon dioxide gas, a precaution to prevent fires and explosions spreading that had been instituted as a result of the Yorktown's battle experience at the Coral Sea. By superhuman effort, engineers managed to get enough steam out of their patched-up boilers to push the carrier through the water at 30 knots. The Yorktown's fighter controllers, also recalling the lessons of the Coral Sea, managed to gain altitude to shoot down 3 of the escorting Zeros and 6 of the bombers before they began their attack. Warned that the enemy was diving in, Fletcher coolly rapped back, "Well, I've got on my tin hat. I can't do anything now." But the carrier's gunners could, and did. They knocked 2 more Vals out of the sky before they could release their bombs. Of the 6 that plummeted down, only 3 hit. One plane failed to pull out of its dive and disintegrated, its bomb rolling along the flight deck before it exploded, causing fires. Another bomb went through the smokestack. The backdraft of its explosion temporarily put out the burners in 5 of the carrier's 6 boilers. Steam pressure fell, and the Yorktown's speed began to drop as a 3rd bomb penetrated the flight deck to pass clean through the hangar, before detonating and starting a conflagration on the armoured 4th deck. 3 such hits had doomed each of the Japanese carriers, but the prompt flooding of the Yorktown's magazines, the use of CO's gas to prevent fuel lines from igniting, and the fast work of the fire control parties had checked the blaze in less than an hour. By 1:40, the engineers had refired the boilers, and wooden planks patched the gaping hole in the flight deck. Captain Buckmeister was able to ring for 20 knots, turn his carrier into the wind, and recover the remaining dive bombers before they ran out of fuel. Because the bomb which had passed through the smokestack had destroyed the radar, and subsequent fires had wiped out his communications centre, Admiral Fletcher had been obliged to transfer his flag to the cruiser Astoria, passing over tactical command to Spruance on the Enterprise. General elation greeted the valiant efforts of Captain Buckmeister's crew, who restored full airstrike capability to Task Force 17. Admiral Nagumo could not know the magnitude of his defeat. Now, 200 miles to the southwest of the Yorktown, he was leading a shattered strike force north after abandoning his 3 blazing carriers to the care of destroyers. After the triple blow he had suffered, the report came from the Hiryu that their first strike had hit and certainly sunk the American carrier, so that he believed only one remained. He still saw the chance to escape a disastrous defeat. That hope vanished shortly after 1 p.m., after the return of the aircraft that had been dispatched before the first American attack to make a full reconnaissance of the enemy units at sea off Midway. His mission negated by the radio failure, the unfortunate pilot had returned to find his carrier a blazing wreck, forcing him to land on the Hiryu with the bad news that he had definitely identified at least 2 American carriers. This was alarming enough for Admiral Yamaguchi, who was congratulating himself on having disposed of the enemy threat. It confirmed the worst fears of Admiral Nagumo, who realized that he was now facing odds of at least 2 to 1. Until the first strike aircraft returned and were refueled, Yamaguchi only had 10 torpedo planes left with which to attack. They were launched at 1:30, escorted by 6 fighters. So vital was this mission considered by Lieutenant Tomonaga, the Hiryu's senior pilot, that he insisted on leading it, though his own aircraft's damaged fuel tank would make no return trip. An hour later, Tomonaga was nearing the end of his life-threatening mission less than 50 miles from Task Force 17, when a cruiser's radar picked up the Japanese planes coming in low from the southwest. Warnings were flashed to the Yorktown, which had time to get 4 more Wildcats up to join the 8 already flying cover, and they headed out to intercept. Tangling with the Zeros, they shot down 1, as the Kates, dividing their attack, raced toward the Yorktown at masthead height from several directions. The 4 heavy cruisers screening the carrier tried the new tactic of shelling the sea ahead with their heavy guns to throw up a barrier of water. It proved too insubstantial to stop 4 determined Japanese pilots from crashing through to drop their long-lance torpedoes less than 500 yards from the Yorktown's bow, passing so close that the deck gunners could see the pilots shaking their fists in defiance. Captain Buckmeister's damaged ship lacked the speed to maneuver fast enough to dodge all the torpedoes. 2 ploughed into the carrier's port quarter, ripping open her hull along the fuel tanks and jamming the rudder. Thousands of tons of the Pacific poured through the gash, sending the Yorktown heeling over in an alarming list. Damage control parties were soon reporting that they could not handle the flooding because the temporary repairs had left the carrier far from watertight. Anticipating an imminent capsize, Buckmeister gave the order to abandon ship just before 3 p.m. destroyers quickly secured alongside the keeling carrier to make such an efficient rescue of the survivors that no crew member was lost. Many sailors who had taken to the water were good-naturedly calling out, "Taxi, taxi," as the boats moved about in the flat calm, picking them up. While Captain Buckmeister was taking what later turned out to be a premature decision to abandon the Yorktown, her scouting flight of 10 Dauntlesses, which had set out an hour earlier, arrived over the remnants of Nagumo's force at around 2:45 p.m. Lieutenant Wallace C. Short, in the lead, spotted the squared-off shape of a carrier far below. This sighting of the Hiryu, some 110 miles northwest of Task Force 17, meant that the Americans had finally located the 4th carrier predicted by the pre-battle intelligence estimates. When the news was radioed back to Task Force 16, Spruance turned the Enterprise to windward at 3:30 to launch off another strike of 24 dive bombers, including 10 Yorktown Dauntlesses that had sought refuge while their carrier was being bombed. There were no Wildcats to spare for a fighter escort because they were held back to fly combat air patrol over the task forces. This did not unduly concern Lieutenant Wilmer E. Gallagher, who was eager for the chance to wipe out a second enemy carrier only 7 hours after he had successfully attacked the Kaga. It was just before 5 p.m. when the new American strike arrived high over the Hiryu, half an hour after the carrier's 5 surviving torpedo planes and 3 fighters had landed back to attest to Lieutenant Tomonaga's posthumous triumph in supposedly sinking the Yorktown. Unaware that they had targeted the same carrier earlier claimed as sunk by the first Japanese strike, Yamaguchi's arithmetic showed he only had 1 carrier left to sink. 5 dive bombers, 5 torpedo planes, and 6 fighters remained for him to reverse defeat into victory, but he decided first to feed his exhausted air crews while fueling and rearming the planes for a strike at dusk. A fast reconnaissance plane was ordered off at 5:03 p.m. to locate the United States carrier while the rest of Hiryu's hungry crew were tucking into sweet rice balls. Then the lookouts in the squat bridge sang out, "Enemy dive bombers directly overhead." There was not even time for the buglers to sound off the alarm before Gallagher's Dauntlesses came belting in out of the sinking sun. Deft, evasive action on the helm avoided the first 3 bombs, but the next 4 tore along the deck like an explosive can opener, blasting the forward elevator into the island and starting fires in the hangars below. Minutes later, the attack was over. All but 3 Dauntlesses made it back to the Enterprise safely by dusk, to report that they had won the unique distinction of sinking 2 carriers on a single day. The Hiryu continued to struggle on at nearly 30 knots, as all hands except the gunners turned to battle the conflagrations. Most of their firefighting equipment had been wiped out, and the bucket chains that were formed proved hopeless in fighting the exploding bombs and torpedoes which had been brought up to the hangar to arm the evening strike. Deck by deck, the blaze spread downward, trapping the engine room gangs in a fiery tomb. The Hiryu was still underway, like a floating torch, trailing a great column of smoke, when she was spotted shortly after 6 p.m. by B-17 Fortresses flown out from Midway to make another strike. For the second time that day, all the Army bombs missed. As darkness fell, Midway's remaining marine bombers and torpedo planes took off to make a night attack, but they failed to find the burning carrier, which had steamed much farther than anticipated before her turbines died. It was after 1 a.m. before Admiral Yamaguchi began preparing for the ceremonial ritual that preceded the order to abandon ship, while a series of explosions roared through the blazing wreck. Wreathed in smoke, Captain Kaku solemnly passed the Emperor's picture for transfer to a destroyer as the diminutive Admiral Yamaguchi stood on a biscuit tin to deliver an emotional farewell address. After exchanging ceremonial cups of water with his flag captain, the two led the singing of the Kimigayo anthem. Survivors were being taken aboard the destroyers as Yamaguchi and Kaku paused to wonder at the beauty of the moon before retiring to their cabins to commit seppuku, ritual kamikaze. Final orders were for a destroyer to torpedo the Hiryu, but she was found afloat at daybreak with 70 men still alive on board. They were taken off before the burnt-out wreck was finally dispatched at noon. The succession of blows that had knocked out the last carrier in Admiral Nagumo's strike force signalled his crushing defeat. "The game is up," was the reaction of Admiral Yamamoto's yeoman at 5:30 that afternoon, as he passed to the Commander-in-Chief the dire message just received from the cruiser Nagara. Hiryu hit by bombs and set afire. The members of the staff, their mouths shut tight, conferred for more than an hour over charts, checking off the dispositions of the remaining units. Racing down from the North Pacific, after making a second airstrike against Dutch Harbour, was Admiral Kakuta with his 2 carriers and heavy cruisers. Up from the west, Admiral Kondo was heading toward Midway with his light carrier, 2 battleships and 4 heavy cruisers, and from the northwest, Admiral Kurita was bearing down at full speed with 4 heavy cruisers and 3 seaplane tenders. Bringing up the rear was the main force, with the mighty Yamato, 2 battleships and a light carrier. If this formidable force could join up with Nagumo's 2 surviving battleships and 3 cruisers, Yamamoto saw a chance still to win a decisive naval engagement. To rally his scattered forces, the Commander-in-Chief flashed out an optimistic signal that evening. "The enemy fleet has been practically destroyed and is retiring to the eastward." Orders went out for the occupation of Midway to proceed as planned the next day. To Nagumo, receiving Yamamoto's 7 p.m. orders that all units were to immediately contact and destroy the enemy force, the signal seemed hopelessly impractical in the light of the last intelligence report, radioed in from the plane that had left the Hiris just before the final attack, indicating that yet more enemy carriers were at sea. Total enemy strength is 5 carriers, 6 heavy cruisers and 15 destroyers. They are steaming westward. We are retiring to the northwest, escorting Hiryu. Speed 18 knots. This very abrupt defiance of his orders was interpreted in turn by Yamamoto's Chief of Staff, Admiral Ugaki, to mean that Nagumo has no stomach for a night engagement. He knew the Americans could not possibly have 5 carriers at sea anywhere in the Pacific. At the most, he calculated that there could be only 2 operational. Yamamoto was hoping to bring whatever forces were lurking north of Midway into a battle that night, when he would have enough battleships and cruisers to win a victory that would wipe out the defeat the Imperial Navy had suffered during the day. Accordingly, he signalled to Admiral Kondo to take over tactical command and deploy his battleships and cruisers. Nagumo's force was ordered to reverse course immediately and participate in the night engagement. Once again, Yamamoto's plans were cast on the expectation that the enemy would fall in with his scheme. But a night engagement off Midway could only come about if the American force continued steaming eastward. In fact, Spruance, for his part, was well aware of the dangers of taking Task Force 16 farther west. Analysis of the Japanese radio traffic gave a strong indication that another large force was bearing in from the northwest, and that the carriers that had attacked Dutch Harbour were apparently bearing down from the north to cut him off from Hawaii. Moreover, The B-17s that had attacked the Hiryu at dusk had reported being attacked by Zeros. These might have come from the burning carrier, or there might be a second carrier in the vicinity. Even allowing for the tactical advantage that radar would give his ships, Spruance decided that to chase Nagumo's battered force into the night could hazard the victory he and Fletcher had won. I did not feel justified in risking a night encounter with possibly superior enemy forces, he would give as the reason for caution. But on the other hand, I did not want to be too far away from Midway the next morning. I wished to have a position from which either to follow up retreating enemy forces or break up a landing in Midway. Once he had recovered the last strike planes, the American task force withdrew east until midnight, when they reversed course to bring them back within striking distance of threatened Midway at dawn. Although he faced later criticism for giving up the pursuit, Spruance's tactical judgment proved absolutely correct. Had he continued westward, he would certainly have run into the trap that Yamamoto set and, with his carriers unable to operate their planes at night, would have fallen easy prey to the guns of Kondo's battleships and Kurita's heavy cruisers. After an anxious wait until midnight for word that the enemy force had been contacted, Yamamoto faced the downfall of his plan for luring the Americans into a night action. He and his staff now had to worry about the massacre that would occur if dawn caught them too near Midway's aircraft or strikes from the returning enemy carriers. The advice of some of his staff was that the atoll should be bombarded and captured as a face-saving operation, but Admiral Ugaki dismissed such an option. Our battleships, for all their firepower, would be destroyed by enemy air and submarine attacks before we could even get close enough to use our big guns. The capture of Midway would have to be postponed. But even if that proves impossible, and we must accept defeat in this operation, we will not have lost the war. There will still be 8 carriers in the fleet, counting those which are to be completed soon. In battle, as in chess, it is the fool who lets himself be led into a reckless move through desperation. Not all his staff were prepared to accept Ugaki's hard-faced analysis. Some asked, "How are we going to apologize to His Majesty for this defeat?" Their commander-in-chief, who had maintained silent counsel, now made it clear he would swallow that most bitter of pills. "Leave that to me," Yamamoto interrupted. "I am the only one who must apologize to His Majesty. Midway operation is cancelled," was flashed out at midnight from the combined fleet flagship. By abandoning the plan, Yamamoto not only accepted defeat, but also resigned himself to the fact that bringing off a war-winning naval victory against the Americans would now be more difficult to achieve. The transports carrying the invasion force turned back for Saipan. Admirals Kondo and Kurita were ordered to join up with Nagumo and rendezvous to the northwest, with the main force to return to Japan. Only the northern units were signalled to go ahead with the planned occupation of the 2 Aleutian islands. A few shells from a lone Japanese submarine defiantly but harmlessly splashing into Midway's lagoon were a reminder of the combined fleet's awesome gunpower, which had been defeated by the United States Pacific Fleet's carrier aircraft without ever having had a chance to launch a salvo. The night of despair was over for Yamamoto, who promptly retired to his cabin complaining again of stomach pains. The collapse of Operation MI was to tarnish the Imperial Navy's record, its first defeat made more humiliating when 2 ships in Kurita's cruiser force were later involved in a collision some 90 miles northwest of Midway. After receiving the recall signal, the 4 heavy cruisers of the Occupation Support Force were steaming across the Pacific at 28 knots when a lookout spotted a submarine. The leading pair swung violently to port, but the stern Marco Mogami did not pick up the signal until too late, ramming into the Mikuma ahead of her. Although he had not had a chance to fire his torpedoes, the skipper of the USS Tamba, before crash-diving to avoid the onrushing destroyers, was delighted to see that one cruiser was aflame at the bows. The Mogami, one of the world's fastest and most powerful cruisers, had its bows wrecked, and Mikuma was badly damaged. Quick work in shoring up their damaged bulkheads enabled them to limp away at 12 knots under heavy escort. The night of June 4 was not without its anxiety for Admiral Nimitz and his staff at Pearl Harbor. News that their task forces had knocked out and set ablaze 4 Japanese carriers suggested they had victory in their grasp, unless Spruance blundered into a night engagement. Nimitz was certain that he did not have to remind his commander on the spot of the risks such a battle would bring when he sent out a message that evening. You who have participated in the Battle of Midway today have written a glorious page in our history. I am proud to be associated with you. I estimate that another day of all-out effort on your part will complete the defeat of the enemy. The Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet War Diary noted that June 4 had seen the start of what may be the greatest sea battle since Jutland. Its outcome, if as unfavourable to the Japanese as seems indicated, will virtually end their expansion. In Washington, the Navy Department was cautiously guarded. Their release to the press on the morning of June 5 indicated that a major naval action was going on in the Pacific, which appeared to be falling in the United States' favour. It is too early to claim a major Japanese disaster. The enemy are continuing to withdraw, but we are continuing the battle. Reading between the lines of officialese, the reporters sensed the growing assurance of the Navy that the outcome would make the biggest headlines since Pearl Harbor. Admiral Spruance, like the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet Staff, fully expected that the battle would begin afresh the next morning. At dawn, the PBYs were racing off Midway's lagoon to reconnoitre the enemy units. Heavy overcast and low visibility hampered their search operations as Task Force 16 steamed at a safe distance to the northeast off the atoll, while Spruance waited for news of which Japanese force to attack with an airstrike. For the pilots aboard the American carriers, it was a long morning of waiting, an anticlimax to the action they were anticipating. The Marines' remaining Dauntlesses and Vindicators took off soon after dawn to attack the two crippled cruisers that had been reported by the Tambor. The Japanese gunners put up a fierce barrage, which cost an American plane without inflicting any more damage on either the Mogami or the Mikuma. Late that afternoon, when Spruance was convinced from the morning reconnaissance that all enemy heavy units were retreating westward, he launched a strike against the cruisers. Failing to locate them, the American planes dropped their bombs wildly, leaving unscathed a lone destroyer that had been sent to Mogami's assistance. The main action for the United States Navy that anticlimactic day was the battle to save the Yorktown. She had been found at dawn still afloat by the destroyer Hughes, which had come alongside to investigate reports of gunfire. Two wounded sailors who had crawled up from the sickbay where they had been left for dead the previous day had been responsible for the shots. Finding that the fires were out, the Hughes' skipper put a salvage party aboard and radioed for help to save the drifting carrier. When the minesweeper Vireo appeared, the two small vessels spent the afternoon struggling to take the huge Yorktown in tow, their efforts hampered by a rising sea. At dusk, the destroyer Hamon arrived with Captain Buckmeister and a volunteer party drawn from his crew. The fight to salvage the dead carrier and counter her flooding compartments went on all night, with the Hamon alongside supplying power to work the pumps. The battle for the drifting Yorktown might have been won had she not been sighted the previous morning by one of the reconnaissance float planes sent out from Nagumo's retreating cruisers. The nearest Japanese submarine was radioed to sink the carrier, but because of inaccurate reports of the position, took a day and a half to find its quarry. The Yorktown's list had been corrected, and hopes were rising that she might be brought back to Pearl Harbor with the arrival of tugs. But the captain of Imperial Navy submarine 168 had finally fixed the carrier in the crosswires of his attack periscope. On the afternoon of June 6, one torpedo hit the Hamon, breaking the destroyer in two and sinking her with heavy loss of life. Others slammed into her bulky charge. For the second time in 2 days, Buckmeister was forced to abandon ship, although he hoped to get one of the other destroyers alongside to resume salvage operations next morning. Without power to keep the pumps going, the Yorktown that night succumbed to the flooding, capsizing and settling deep in the Pacific. The whole saga of her dismal end, after the glorious fight she had put up at the Coral Sea and Midway, was an indelible lesson to every skipper in the United States Navy not to abandon ship prematurely. While the battle was still going on to save the Yorktown, Admiral Spruance was planning to take advantage of perfect flying weather to resume his pursuit of the enemy, now that it was clear the Japanese had abandoned their efforts to invade Midway and were in full retreat. The old naval maxim that a stern chase is a long one proved to be only too true. Yamamoto had not given up all hope that he might still have a chance of victory if the American force ventured far enough west to allow the Japanese to operate in conjunction with airstrikes from the plains on Wake Island. But once again, Spruance had second-guessed him by sending out a strike of dive bombers west that morning to locate the two damaged cruisers, which he knew would be trying to reach the protection of the atoll's Japanese base. They located both crippled vessels at mid-morning. They were helpless targets, as easy as shooting ducks in a barrel. One of the Enterprise pilots radioed in excitement as the Mikuma sank in a mass of flames. Badly mauled and on fire, the Mogami still bore a charmed life, managing to limp away and eventually reach the sanctuary of Truk. The pictures that were taken of the two battered cruisers, smoke and flames rearing from their battered turrets, were to be dramatic proof to the American public of the smashing victory won off Midway by their Pacific fleet. The triumph was only slightly dimmed by the news that the Japanese had landed without opposition on the most westerly Aleutian island, Attu, to make prisoners of a handful of Aleut Eskimos and the 10 members of the weather station. With the simultaneous occupation of uninhabited Kiska, this gave enemy propaganda a chance to inflate the dramatic claim that the rising sun was now flying over the United States mainland. What had been originally intended as the northern outpost of a mid-Pacific defensive perimeter would prove to be a strategic liability without the possession of Midway. The Japanese clung stubbornly to their prize. Nimitz realized that the public would be upset by the fact that the enemy was technically on American shores, and the day after the landings he ordered Task Force 16 to head north to launch strikes against the islands in an attempt to dislodge this embarrassing new outpost of Japan. Spruance was relieved next day to learn from the signal recalling him to Pearl Harbor that Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet had thought better of allowing his carriers to venture where they might be ambushed by battleships and submarines in the foggy northern waters. Yamamoto had been robbed of his last opportunity to salvage something from the defeat, whose catastrophic implications for Japan were soon to become apparent. The transports returned to Saipan with the 5,000 troops, wondering what disaster had befallen the invincible Imperial Navy. The action off Midway, which marked the beginning of the end of the Japanese Empire, cost the Imperial Navy not only its undefeated record but 4 carriers and a heavy cruiser, the lives of 2,200 sailors, 234 aircraft, and the best of their naval aviation. "I felt like swearing," Admiral Ugaki wrote of the defeat, which bore even more heavily on his commander-in-chief. Declaring that it was all his responsibility, and they were not to criticize the Nagumo force, Yamamoto retired to his quarters, complaining of stomach cramps, refusing to see any of his staff for 3 days. Aboard the Nagato, Admiral Nagumo wretchedly blamed himself for the disaster, and had to be persuaded by his staff not to take their own lives. A major effort to cover up the magnitude of their defeat was launched on June 10 by the naval staff in Tokyo, who feared public reaction and a severe loss of face. Heralded by the blaring strains of the Navy March, the radio announcer read a communiqué that Japan had secured supreme power in the Pacific, and that the war had been determined by one battle in which one Imperial Navy carrier had been sunk to 2 losses by the United States Navy, along with 120 of their planes. Lantern parades were staged in Tokyo to celebrate this new victory, when 4 days later the combined fleet made an unheralded return to the Hiroshima anchorage. There were no comments about the absence of 4 carriers because they were not missed, having been continuously at sea since the war began. The survivors of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu and Hiryu were hustled off without leave to outlying bases in Japan and the Pacific. The wounded were landed by night and taken to sealed hospital wards, where they were denied visits by their next of kin. The United States Navy was at first circumspect about its victory. On June 6, when it became clear that the Japanese were in retreat, Nimitz radioed a congratulatory signal promising that the Pacific Fleet would continue to make the enemy realize that war is hell. His staff celebrated with the Jeroboam of champagne, dressed up with admiral's stripes that General Emmons sent to Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet with his compliments, and a promise never to doubt naval intelligence in the future. Nimitz magnanimously sent his car to fetch Commander Rochefort to the party, but he was so long changing from his informal attire into uniform that he arrived after the champagne had run dry. Nimitz nevertheless paid him the tribute before his whole staff. This officer deserves a major share of the credit for the victory at Midway. On June 7, Fleet Admiral King in Washington held his first press conference since being appointed Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet. He allowed that the enemy force have taken some hard knocks. Coming from the flinty admiral, most reporters knew this meant that a sizable triumph had been chalked up by the United States Navy. That same morning, the Chicago Tribune headlined, "Navy had word of Japan plan to strike at sea." The reporter Stanley Johnson had seen an after-action dispatch from which he was able to deduce the explosive revelation that victory had been made possible by a dramatic intelligence breakthrough. The story raised a storm behind the scenes, with King charging that it endangered the entire Pacific War. The panic blew over, however, when it appeared that Tokyo's intelligence staff apparently did not read American newspapers. The lapse in security was not repeated. All officers throughout the Navy were threatened by personal directive from Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet, with instant court-martial if any such leaks occurred in future. The triumph of the American carriers at Midway was won by the tenacity and secrecy of United States naval intelligence, and by the bravery of individual pilots, as much as by the cool tactical judgments of Admirals Fletcher and Spruance and Admiral Nimitz's bold strategic calculations. It was a battle that was also helped by the Japanese's fatal victory disease. The significance of the United States triumph was not lost on Admiral King, who wrote, "The Battle of Midway was the first decisive defeat suffered by the Japanese Navy in 350 years. Furthermore, it put an end to the long period of Japanese offensive action and restored the balance of naval power in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor has now been partially avenged." Admiral Nimitz's communiqué of June 6, 1942, announced, "Vengeance will not be complete until Japanese sea power is reduced to impotence." The public euphoria over the Midway triumph in America was in strong contrast to the bitterness developing between the Army and Navy factions, as the debate between them reopened on the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Admiral King argued for keeping up the momentum against the Japanese by pressing ahead with the Pacific Fleet's offensive in the Solomons. The Australians wanted an invasion of Timor, where their soldiers, along with Dutch troops, were waging a guerrilla campaign, but General MacArthur wanted to marshal Allied sea and air strength for a massive assault on Rabaul. General Marshall, who regarded the Midway victory as the closest squeak, was against launching any offensive in the Pacific, because he was convinced that disaster was looming across the Atlantic. "It must confess, I view with great concern the Russian front," read President Roosevelt's cable to Churchill on June 6, which informed him that our operations in the Pacific are going well with the news of Midway. The Red Army had been defeated in the Ukraine at Kharkov, and the German offensive was rolling toward the Crimea and the Caucasus. Stalin's foreign minister, Molotov, had flown to London and then Washington to get British and American commitment to a landing on the continent in August or September. Churchill, however, would give no promise. His concern, like that of his military chiefs, was that a hasty cross-channel assault in 1942 to relieve pressure on Russia would be a sacrificial landing, and he had carefully made it conditional upon the availability of troops and transports. The Prime Minister knew that this was in fact unlikely. Britain's Eighth Army had had to fall back on Tobruk after a massive defeat inflicted by Rommel that cost hundreds of tanks and thousands of casualties. Troops on their way to India were now being diverted to meet the danger to the Suez Canal. Nearly a million tons of merchant tonnage had been lost to the U-boat blitz still raging in American waters, and the severe shipping crisis put a vice-like grip on any extension of strategic operations. Until the ambitious American Liberty ship-building program could mass-produce vessels faster than the enemy could sink them, priority had to be given to maintaining the Atlantic lifeline. To resolve the crisis that was again threatening Allied strategy, Churchill proposed another conference. From his daily telephone discussions with the Prime Minister, the President was keenly aware of the impending disaster overtaking the British in the Mediterranean. The United States Joint Chiefs were alarmed that Roosevelt might jump the traces and support launching the Second Front not in Europe but in North Africa. On June 17, while Churchill's flying boat was droning across the North Atlantic, The British Chiefs of Staff's blunt memorandum advising against any such operation was being read by Roosevelt at Hyde Park. Next day, while they were still adamantly insisting to the United States chiefs that there should be no substantial landing in France this year, the Prime Minister flew down to the President's Hudson Valley estate for a personal summit, during which he sought support for his alternative Second Front strategy. On June 20, the two leaders took one of history's momentous decisions: to pool national efforts and pay whatever price was necessary to develop the atomic bomb. As Churchill recorded that the Allies could not run the mortal risk of being outstripped in this awful sphere. Scientists working for the top-secret British Tube Alloys project had already shown that such a terrible weapon was theoretically feasible, but only the United States, whose own scientific team was working on the problem too, had the colossal industrial and financial resources to make the bomb. Within 2 months, the multi-billion-dollar technological effort disguised by the cover name Manhattan Engineer District was being set up under the control of the United States Army, with access to unlimited secret funding. Next day, the President and the Prime Minister arrived back in Washington to find the unresolved debate on the 1942 Second Front strategy overshadowed by news that the fortress of Tobruk had been captured. It was feared that the German Second Army might burst through the Caucasus to link up with the Afrika Korps, advancing across Palestine on the plains of Armageddon. To aid in countering Rommel's offensive, which imperiled the Middle East, the President unhesitatingly offered to send tanks, guns, and ammunition by sea. Shell fuses and medical supplies were to be flown in by a new air route across Africa. To assist the defense of Egypt, he even promised a United States armored division if it was needed. 48 hours later, when Churchill began his long flight back across the Atlantic to take personal charge of the crisis and face another vote of censure by Parliament, the issue of the cross-channel attack was still unresolved. However, it was already plain that the need to rush emergency convoys out to the Middle East would severely curtail major operations in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. July would bring no respite to the hard-pressed British Army in North Africa as Rommel's panzers pressed on to El Alamein, and in Russia General von Bock's Army South overran the Crimea and prepared for the drive onto Rostov and Stalingrad. The tide of German victories brought renewed fears that Japan had decided now was the time, with the Red Army on the brink of defeat, to launch an attack in Siberia. Magic intercepts of the Berlin-Tokyo circuit and the flow of traffic from Japanese consulates in South America all pointed to an imminent widening of her war effort. The President worried that this might be the final blow that would push the Soviet Union into defeat. But Washington's fears were allayed to a degree by the report of Military Intelligence Service's Special Branch, which reviewed the evidence and concluded that the diplomatic offensive was a plot that had all the hallmarks of a wily Oriental mind. It soon proved accurate and was the first major contribution to the secret intelligence war made by the work of the unit established under Colonel Alfred McCormick. An outstanding member of the New York Bar, he was appointed a special assistant to the Secretary of War, with the task of recruiting a team of experts to make the kind of overall assessment and interpretation of magic intelligence that might have saved the United States from the Pearl Harbor debacle. Drawing on some of the best legal brains under the leadership of Carter W. Clark, who was appointed colonel in command of the Special Service Branch, they organized the critical and interpretative assessment of the massive intelligence material along the lines established by the British teams, who were evaluating German Enigma traffic for the Ultra operation. It was therefore ironic that the evaluation and application of intelligence had just been fumbled by the Royal Navy, where the likely movements of the Tirpitz were concerned. Anticipation that Hitler's biggest battleship was about to attack had led to the decision to scatter the PQ-17 convoy ploughing north toward Russia during the first days of July. She remained in the Norwegian fjords as the helpless merchantmen were bombed and torpedoed by the Luftwaffe and U-boats. The Admiralty decided to call off any further attempts to ship the badly needed aid to the Soviet Union. Stalin angrily protested, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington began to believe that the Red Army might only be saved from defeat by an immediate diversionary attack on France. Churchill firmly ruled out any such precipitate action in his July 8 cable to Roosevelt. His excuse that there were just no resources with which the British Army could carry out the sledgehammer assault plan left the United States Army Chief of Staff so stirred up that he took the unusual step of presenting a joint memorandum with Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet that advised the President that he should insist on the British honouring their obligations, or we should turn to the Pacific and strike decisively at Japan. The ploy to threaten Churchill with a strategic about-face in the direction of the Allied war effort was Marshall's own idea, but 15 years later he would suggest that in my case it was a bluff, but King wanted the alternative. However, it was immediately called by Roosevelt himself during a strained and stormy meeting in the White House on July 12, 1942. During the 2-hour session with his chiefs of staff, the President let it be known that he was favouring sending troops to North Africa to help the British and also satisfy his own political need to get a major part of the 3 million United States Army troops into action before the end of the year. Marshall and King flew to London for a tough bargaining session. They found the British immovably against the sledgehammer, cross-channel operations, and in a discussion that Churchill termed strategic natural selection, they were left no choice but to agree to the gymnast operation. Rechristened Torch, it called for the United States Army to invade North Africa that autumn, while the assault on the European mainland was postponed. The British agreed only to a token raid on Dieppe to placate the Russians. The Prime Minister said he would undertake a risky mission to Moscow, like carrying a large lump of ice to the North Pole, to explain personally to Stalin why there would be no second front in 1942. Once again, the crisis over Allied strategy had been resolved by the President holding firmly to his Europe First doctrine. The defeat of Germany means the defeat of Japan, probably without even firing a shot, he insisted. Marshall took a less sanguine view, yet he too had held the same belief, although he resented being manoeuvred by the British into committing American forces to the indirect route to Berlin via North Africa. The United States Army Chief had realized there was no alternative for 1942 if he was to get his divisions into the land campaign. Switching to the Pacific would have given no chance to come to grips with the Japanese in battles that would have to be fought out on tropical islands and jungle peninsulas, and he had already decided that this must primarily be an amphibious war. Admiral King was now vociferously pressing for his offensive against Japan, a campaign Congress also clamoured for. Its first objective would be to hurl the Japanese out of the Aleutians. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, however, relegated this mission to the bottom of their strategic priorities. Admiral Theobald's small task force could be relied upon to blockade and raid the strategically insignificant enemy toeholds on the bleak islands of Kiska and Attu. The Army Air Force, with the aid of the civil airlines, would then open up an air supply route through some of the world's most hostile flying conditions, along which troops and supplies could be mustered for an eventual offensive down the Aleutians. With Midway now secure, the strategic focus in the Pacific shifted back to New Guinea and the Solomons, where the enemy was still able to threaten Australia. While the Southwest Pacific was primarily General MacArthur's area of operations, he began his bid to win control of the entire Pacific theatre by demanding a Marine Division and 2 carrier task forces to carry out a grandly conceived offensive named Tulsa. The operation was intended to take Rabaul in 2 weeks, forcing the enemy back 700 miles to his base at Truk. King's opinion of the general as little short of megalomaniacal had been coloured by Admiral Hart's unflattering and highly charged personal report on his role in bringing about the disaster in the Philippines. In any event, the autocratic admiral was not about to hand over control of the few precious carriers in the Pacific. He wanted them to play a vital role in launching his own offensive drive north up into the Solomons, which he believed could take Rabaul in a month. His insistence that such operations were of a primarily naval and amphibious character, and therefore properly subject to the control of Admiral Nimitz, effectively prevented MacArthur from launching an offensive of any scale. The general's strident protest that this was another move by the Navy cabal to assume general command of all operations in the Pacific theatre brought Marshall into a direct confrontation with the Chief of Naval Operations. For 2 weeks, a fierce battle was fought between the Army and Navy chiefs over who was going to run the Pacific War. A heated exchange of memoranda was fired back and forth, and King threatened to go ahead with his offensive independently of army consent. To heal the breach, on July 26, Marshall agreed to a compromise that the Navy had proposed earlier. A decision was reached with great difficulty a week later, and a directive issued on July 2, 1942, which laid down the objectives for the first stages of the limited United States offensive against Japan. Admiral Nimitz was to be in overall command of Task 1, the capture of the Santa Cruz Islands as a preliminary to attacking the Japanese's Mid-Solomons base at Tulagi, opposite Guadalcanal Island, by August 1. General MacArthur was to begin Task 2, a parallel drive to oust the Japanese from New Guinea, preparatory to launching Task 3, the invasion of New Britain and the capture of Rabaul. To avert a dispute between MacArthur and Nimitz's South Pacific Area commander, Admiral Gormley, the Joint Chiefs neatly shifted the Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet boundary westward of Guadalcanal to bring the Lower Solomons under Navy control. The stage was now set for Task 1, which had been prophetically codenamed Operation Watchtower, in deference to King's intention that it should be the curtain-raiser to the Navy's Pacific campaign. On July 3, the Commander-in-Chief United States Fleet Staff flew to San Francisco to outline the plan to Admiral Nimitz. They found him badly shaken by a narrow brush with death when the flying boat bringing him from Pearl Harbor capsized on landing, killing the pilot. On Independence Day, the United States Navy brass assembled in the Federal Building to hear Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner outline the operation. Fiercely outspoken, Turner was a brilliant tactician who had been head of the Navy's War Plans Division until February, when his evident partisanship had made it impossible for him to work alongside the Army planners. Then King had appointed him Commander of Amphibious Forces in the South Pacific under Admiral Gormley, who was not at the briefing because he had been sent to Melbourne to mend the Navy's fences and secure the cooperation of MacArthur. Optimism infused the conference. Despite the losses of 2 American carriers at Coral Sea and Midway, the Japanese had sacrificed their main strike force, while Nimitz could form 4 task forces around the Saratoga, Enterprise, Hornet and Wasp, as well as the first of the newly commissioned